Welcome to Intangibles, a podcast about the traits, behaviors, and qualities that entrepreneurs can cultivate to help be successful. This podcast is created by Antecedent Ventures, an enterprise-focused seed-stage venture firm in New York City. You can find us at www.antecedent.vc. I'm your host, Steve Berg. This season is brought to you by Denton's Venture Technology Group at dentonsventurebeyond.com. Operating as a boutique within the world's largest law firm, the Venture Technology Group runs with hard-charging tech entrepreneurs to drive growth through strategic business, finance, and legal advice, from Silicon Valley and New York to London, Berlin, Hong Kong, and beyond. Learn more at dentonsventurebeyond.com. Today's topics are inclusion, diversity, and empathy. Beyond empathy, I'm not sure that these are purely intangible qualities, but I do believe that each is essential for companies and leaders that want to succeed in an environment where cultural and demographic shifts are accelerating, the marketplace is increasingly global in nature, and other economic powers are rising in the world. This is also an important topic as people seem to be becoming more politically polarized around the globe, and some countries, including the United States, are returning to isolationist thinking and policymaking. Andrea Hoffman is a founder, author, and speaker. In 2006, she started Culture Shift Labs to help companies identify and engage with highly sought-after African-American C-suite executives, innovators, investors, inventors, and influencers. In 2010, Andrea co-authored the book Black is the New Green, Marketing to Affluent African Americans. In 2015, she co-authored the book $50 Billion Boss, Stories from African American Women Entrepreneurs on Leadership and Success. Her speaking engagements are too numerous to mention. Hi, Andrea. It's great to speak to you today.
Good morning.
I touched on some of your highlights in the introduction, but there's so much more to know. The path you've taken to becoming an authority on inclusion, diversity, and empathy is very interesting. Could you provide a little bit more backstory?
Absolutely. Back in about 2000, I was working on the agency side on the Mercedes-Benz account. And it was at a time when the brand was shifting its identity from, sort of your father's Mercedes to a younger, more diverse demographic. And my team was in charge of basically evaluating the ways in which the company spent their money and engaged consumers. And so I led a team that, really worked on the marketing communications plan and how we were going to reach these new markets. It was very, very exciting. It was a very, very large budget. And that really, that got me going in this space. Specifically, Yankelovic, which is what it was called at the time, came in and presented the demographic shifts. And, as a former athlete myself, very competitive, and saw that there were these new markets and new business opportunities. And I just had a real aha moment. And that began my journey into being a target marketing expert, actually.
And you were aggressive about this when you saw the data, except the people around you, they weren't necessarily willing to go along with just the data, right? You had to push this.
That's exactly right. I think I learned a lot about corporate politics at that time, and I was fairly naive to that. I knew that I was hired to do a job. I was working for an iconic brand. They had a leadership position, and so I thought it was all about the business. But in many cases, what I learned is that it's about 20% business and 80% politics. And I was really all about the business, and I was all about driving results and driving impact. So I realized at a certain point, it was a couple of years before I actually left corporate, I realized I could do a better job outside the company affecting people inside the company than I could working, directly for the company. So I fast forward, I worked on the BMW account later on and had a really great time with that brand as well. But ultimately, my calling was to be on the outside and being a consultant.
So as a recovering equity analyst, one of the things I find most refreshing about your work is that it is pretty purely data-driven. Could you explain a little bit about the rigor that underpins all the important things that you're going to be explaining to us as we go along today?
Absolutely. So it started with, I want to dial back a second. So when Yankelovic presented this demographic shift data, it was the spending power. There were so many layers to the opportunity. And when I dug into that, I realized that when I left, right, and I started initially a company called Diversity Affluence. That was the first iteration, which ultimately turned into Culture Shift Labs. But I realized that maybe what I should do is gather some secondary research and present that, because the argument wasn't strong enough, and that was across any industry. So I was going to publish some secondary research and really market that. And what I quickly realized is there wasn't a lot of research out there about affluent African Americans. And so I put together, I did some primary research in collaboration with Uptown Magazine, and really started to push the spending power of affluent African Americans. And I don't remember what it was at the exact amount at the moment, but it was just eye-opening that the research wasn't really out there. So that then led me to writing a book with the co-founder of Uptown Magazine. And, we continued to do some research. My company then evolved into Culture Shift Labs. A woman that had been a fan of my work and read my book came to me with this idea of doing a book on Black women entrepreneurs. Her name is Kathy Porter. She's my co-author of $50 Billion Boss. And as we were thinking about titles for the book, she showed me some research from American Express about Black women entrepreneurs. And after a couple of iterations of titles for the book that we wanted to be provocative, I recognized that the research in this American Express report indicated that Black women entrepreneurs have generated $52.6 billion to the American economy since 1996. And hence the name $50 Billion Boss. And after talking to a couple of Black women entrepreneurs, it was obvious that they didn't know their own power as a group. So the idea for the book was to paint an accurate picture of their contribution to the economy, and make sure that they stay in the game and continue to evolve their power and influence, and see how we can help this audience stay in the game, get in the game, and increase double, triple, quadruple their contribution to the economy. So, what I realized about corporate politics is that numbers really do drive a lot of decisions. And so I use that in almost everything that I do because it's very, very eye-opening and certainly helps people make decisions a lot quicker.
I think, one of the things about using your power correctly is understanding your power. So just the idea that you were arming these folks with the data to make good decisions, in and of itself, there's a lot of value in that, right?
Yeah, the value is, at the end of the day, helping companies find new markets and new business opportunities. It just so happens that even if you're a mission-driven company, you're actually helping people and organizations on both sides of the equation. So if you're an entrepreneur and you want to be a supplier, if you're a consumer and you want to make a purchase, equally on the side of corporate, if they're looking to enter new markets, what some companies would call, blue sky, right, or white space. So I could be mission driven and business driven at the same time, and to me that was very, very exciting. I think the difference between myself and maybe some other people that are consultants is that I only go after clients that get it. I don't try to convince anybody what they don't already see and believe in and want to embrace. There's enough businesses out there that are excited that someone like me and my company is doing the heavy lifting and building the case, and they get to just fund and say yes to all the exciting opportunities to engage the consumer and the business owner.
All right. So I think it's time for the big question. I believe that most people think that they have an idea about what diversity and inclusion mean.
Mm-hmm.
But can you tell us what it actually does mean?
So it really is nuanced, but essentially, diversity is showing up to the party, inclusion is being asked to dance. Right. That's the most drill down layman's version. So you could be a supplier for a company and never be given an opportunity to do business with that company. Right. So what good is that? You could be hired by an ad agency to be in a key role that makes important decisions and yet never really be included in those important decisions versus being an order taker. And there's a growing trend around belonging, empathy, and a couple of other trends within that spectrum. And companies are really turning to understanding the fact that your employees spend most of their lives, most of their hours in a day at work. And so, what are some of the levers to helping employees feel more engaged, more valued, and quite frankly, individual contributors in many cases beyond their title? And I'll give you an example. There was, I want to say it was Frito-Lay, many years ago had leveraged their employee resource group, their Hispanic employee resource group, to help them innovate on some products. And the company wasn't doing well in certain markets, in certain categories, and overall in some cases. And so this employee resource group helped the company to come up with a guacamole flavored chip. And it flew off the shelves. It helped put the company back on the map revenue wise, and actually built out a whole new category for them in terms of these flavored chips. And it was based on the insight that these employees that were part of a resource group, they weren't paid anything in addition to their day job. They were asked to be engaged in what they knew about the culture, right? What they were saying, this particular market has this consumer group. We're not doing well in that market. Here's some of the research that we as a company did. And how do we translate that into a product? And it was a phenomenal example around employee engagement.
So, when I hear the word inclusion, to me, that's an action verb, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I know you've talked about it from the perspective of listening, valuing, respecting. What are the actual things that we do? Like, is this in a boardroom? Is this management by walking around? How do we listen, value, respect different viewpoints in the kind of increasingly polarized world in a business environment?
It does stem from culture. So people talk about culture, right? Company culture. If you have a culture where, only the top 2% of the company, experts are valued and included and acted upon, their ideas are acted upon, the rest of the company are really just going to show up, do the minimum, or those that go over and above because it's maybe their nature or because that's what they were taught to do. Eventually you're going to lose that employee, or you're at least going to lose the social and intellectual capital that they bring. And so if you set up a culture that is more inclusive, whether that be that you set up these innovation labs and people from different departments are able to cross-pollinate and contribute and tap into their own genius beyond what they may even realize they have. So culture is a critical component to diversity and inclusion and all these other emerging trends around empathy and belonging. So that's why I think a lot of the consultants, the diversity and inclusion consultants, are looking to startups to say, you know what, you have a blank slate. We're going to help you create a culture that gets it right out of the gate. And you have consultants, you have organizations like, Mitch and Frida Kapoor at Kapor Capital that have gotten their portfolio companies to sign a commitment saying that we're going to get it right out of the gate. And we're going to not only do it for our culture internally, but we're going to do it for the community. So we're committed to giving back to society. So this whole business model around, doing good and doing good, as Johnny Taylor from the Thurgood Marshall says, is critical. So you can do good inside the company, you can do good for the community, and you can still do really well and thrive financially as a company.
So this is interesting. I mean, I would have said for sure that, this has to be part of the culture from the top, right? From the founder or CEO. But you're taking it a step even further and saying, no, this is even before that, from the people that enable these companies by providing them capital, by kind of, saying, look, we have a framework that we want you to follow if you're going to be a partner with us. That's great.
I think it holds people. It's more than holds people accountable. It helps them to, I think, even enjoy their company more than they normally would if they were doing it a different way. What I have found is that you can be a very successful business leader, whether you're an entrepreneur or you work inside of a company. But you get to a point where you're unfulfilled yourself. You could have a great office, you could have a great title, you could have a great salary, you could have a lot of access. But unless you actually feel connected to the universe, connected to other people, and feel like you're creating value, and have a set of values, I think a lot of people get to a point where they're just unhappy and unfulfilled. And if you operate with, a servant leader mentality, it doesn't mean that you have to sacrifice revenue and profitability. And who doesn't want to be a purpose-driven leader? I think the old school of dictatorship, and we're seeing that with our new president, is not. People aren't having it, and it's not working.
I think as I take away from it, for me, it's now what you're basically saying is now it's part of my responsibility as well as an investor. So I think that's great, and I agree with it.
And there are a lot of other people that are doing some similar, taking that model and applying it.
So you started to touch on this. So we live in a capitalist society, which means that quite often there's an economic or other incentive for any given behavior. Let's talk a little bit about the why of diversity and inclusion. I've got some thoughts, and maybe you could fill in the blanks on that. You were talking about profit motive. What in your research thus far has tended to be the value of inclusion on profit motive?
Well, let's start with something simple and take it a couple of steps further. It's a war for talent out there, and every company is trying to figure out whether it's tech employees or whether it's subject matter experts or whether you're dealing with millennials and the way in which they engage and their needs as employees. It's a war for talent. So companies have to understand all demographics very differently. They have to understand the 4 or 5 or 6 generations of people in the workforce, and how do you get a millennial to deal with a Gen Y or an older employee. So if you're not creating, back to culture, if you're not creating the right culture, the right ways to engage your employees, not just engage your clients, there'll be a disconnect with actually producing results. And I could tell you, very and emphatically that millennials want to produce results. They want to do meaningful work that satisfy clients, that create new products that are not killing you chemically. And so there's all kinds of dynamics inside of a company that are critical. And there's you have I don't have the statistics in front of me in terms of the babies that are being born, but it's just a very diverse world. There's interracial marriages, there's more immigration, the percentage of entrepreneurs that are diverse, right? And so you have to engage with them as suppliers. The consumers themselves are making decisions based on companies' external reputations. And if they hear something that is or constantly negative about consumers and how the company treats consumers or treats their employees, you have a couple of companies today that are hitting the news around how they treat certain employees, whether that be women or minorities. And so all of that is really, really critical. And if you don't value people and their differences, and actually use that as one of the levers of an advantage and of value that you're creating, you're really missing the boat. And companies won't survive today if they have really flawed business models.
So I'm going to dive into that just a little bit, because I've always thought of, maybe naively, I've always thought that technology is a great equalizer, right? That the most talented folks will rise no matter what, and that the people can capture the value that they create as a result of that. Is that really the case in terms of what's happening today and what you're seeing, or is it still really a struggle based on their ethnicity or based on where they went to school or any of that?
Well, depends on what you read. If you read all of the negative press around diversity and that's how you're curating your insight, you will think that it's all bad. If you go out of your way to curate all of the articles and insight and be around people that are having conversations about all the great things that are going on, you would be equally, as impressed as you are discouraged, right, around the negative stuff. And so there are companies that are really getting it right. SAP, for example, they've made certain commitments publicly around disability and working with people with disabilities, and they're showing that through their actions. So my perspective is that there is a lot of great things going on. There are a lot of opportunities for leaders to learn from other leaders who are committed, who are genuine and authentic, and who are getting it right. And if you immerse yourself in that, companies will absolutely be able to take a page from the success playbooks of others. And Harvard Business Review has written a lot of those articles. So it really depends on the content that you're curating for yourself. And to me, oftentimes I ask people, what are you reading? Where are you getting your learning from? And who are the people that you're hiring that are bringing those case studies to the table that you can improve upon? So there are a lot of great things going on out there and a lot of people that are getting it right. Does that answer the question?
Yeah. So if I understand you right, I think you're saying that inclusion, diversity, and empathy lead to the ability to recruit more effectively the most talented among those. And then that actually does relate itself to products and profit.
Absolutely. There is, when you think about innovation, and I wrote a paper on this, you can actually find it on the homepage of my website, the Diversity Innovation Connection. And if you think about innovation from the different perspectives, so you have people innovation, you have process innovation, you have product innovation, right? You could be constantly innovating on ways to include employees in product innovation, whether that's squarely their lane or not. You could, think about culture innovation. And if you're committed to that, GE was one of the leaders in innovation, one of the leaders even many, many years ago in diversity in some cases. And so you have to think about innovation in all the different ways that it plays out inside of a company. And if you're known for that, that's critical. Not just publicly known for that, Steve. Not just, we win awards from Diversity Inc. I'm talking about people that work for the company that say, I work here, and I can tell you that what you hear on the outside and the awards that we win actually match the experience of the employee. So I think innovation, it should be understood and embraced and activated in all the ways that it can be.
What about diversity on decision making, right? I think you mentioned the current president. If you take a look at his cabinet, it's pretty homogenous. Certainly, that kind of means that you'll get one opinion and everyone will agree with that. How does decision making for a inclusionary organization, a diverse organization, differ?
Well, you look at neurodiversity. So, do you have the right people around the table, and are people getting a seat at the table that reflect all the different spectrums of diversity? So that would be veterans, that would be age diversity, that would be cultural diversity, that would be new moms. Obviously you can't have a thousand different people at the table at all times, but you definitely want to be deliberate and intentional around who you have at the table, not to check a box as just an exercise, but really to get that neurodiversity around the table. You have even, disabilities around learning, right? So you want to have at least a somewhat of a balanced perspective at the table. There were some commercials recently, I don't remember which one, that I think it was one of the drinks, maybe it was like a 7-Up or a Pepsi, that it was just the consumers out in the market just blasted it on social because it was insensitive. I think it was around Black Lives Matter was sort of the undertone of the commercial. And so clearly they didn't have the right people around the table to vet that idea.
Yep,
And
that was the Kardashian commercial, right?
It was. It was. So, yeah. So, it's really important because it might be something that's so nuanced and you miss it, even though you have the best intentions. I mean, nobody was saying that they had poor intentions. They were just saying that they were ignorant to the message that they were sending out there. And today you have citizen journalism. So you've got to be so careful because that could backfire so quickly on you. And it's just very, very critical. Now, the other part of it is when you talk about diversity and inclusion and even empathy, you can't bring different voices to the table and have that sort of neuro and cultural and ethnic and race diversity, socioeconomic diversity without allowing them to have a voice. And oftentimes that's where you have diversity and not inclusion, because people don't feel like their voice is going to be heard and respected and taken into consideration. And in some cases, it's because of the culture, right? And in some cases, there's a cultural there's a lack of cultural understanding. So if you are an African American from the South and you're going to give your perspective on product innovation based on your cultural heritage, and everybody else in the room doesn't have the context of what you're talking about, but it's critical to that product being created and even marketed, there's a disconnect. And so you need to make sure that people will ask the right questions. Well, what does that mean? And tell me a little bit about the history of that use of that particular ingredient, or why will that resonate with the consumer? If you don't have a curiosity mindset that you create, you can have the diversity without the inclusion.
So if we talk about the corporate culture and the work environment, you're implying that there's some positive impacts associated with that. Like, what does the optimal work environment look like? Right? It's not overly politically correct to the point of being disingenuous.
Yeah.
What in your mind, what is that supposed to look like?
Well, an example that comes to mind is Goldman Sachs, believe it or not. I know the banking industry and the finance industry on Wall Street gets highly criticized for lack of diversity, but nothing is all good or all bad. So if you don't look for the pockets of, companies that are getting it right, or getting parts of it right, you're missing the boat. So Goldman Sachs has these candid conversations with their employees that are led by their leadership. It's not led by the chief diversity officer. It's not led by, the Black Employee Resource Group, they actually have their chairman, CEO, and chief people officer. I don't know exactly who sits in the rooms, but I've watched videos and I've heard about the president and CEO being in a candid conversation with every level of employee around race, around civic leadership, around the importance of compassion and listening and inclusion. And when you have that, and he was asking really important questions that could have made any other leader look ignorant, silly, stupid. And he said, I really don't know. Listen, I'm a white guy. I don't know certain things. And I am confident enough to say that. So teach me. I want to learn. I want to understand. And I want to have a two-way dialogue. That was brilliant. And, you don't necessarily need innovation for that. You just need somebody who is a confident, authentic leader willing to engage and learn.
Yeah, someone willing to be open about it and be able to say the things that they don't fully understand. I'd like to talk about how to do this from the perspective of founders, VCs, maybe some corporates. How do these folks incorporate diversity inclusion into their mindsets? And how should they kind of plan, execute, and measure their progress to make sure that they're doing the right things?
The venture capital world specifically?
Well, I mean, I'm talking about, there's a lot of entrepreneurs and founders that are listening, and they're going to build inclusion, diversity, and empathy into their mindset. How do they go about doing that? And then how do they know that they're doing it correctly? And I would assume that that's by, generating a plan, executing that plan, and measuring the progress against that plan.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I believe that it starts with aligning with the right consultant that's going to build the right sort of cultural business model for you, right? Corporate cultural business model for you. That consultant will help you hire the right either chief diversity officer, chief inclusion officer, chief equality officer, whatever title that you give them, because hiring the right person to create the right culture, to evolve the culture, and to advise your senior leaders when they need to, pivot or adjust, it is absolutely critical. And so it's not necessarily starting out of the gate hiring that person for the chief diversity officer, all the other titles I mentioned that role. It's actually working with a consultant to help you create the right culture and the right environment. You want to have you sometimes want to have candid conversations behind the scenes with people that aren't necessarily inside of the company, right? So that you can start to build your authentic leadership skills. There are a lot of leaders that are a little bit afraid to say the wrong thing or to, create a lawsuit. And all these things are very real. And sometimes it's deliberate and people don't care. And like our president. And there are other times where people, generally care and screw up because human beings are flawed. So I think hiring the right consultant will help you build your culture, understand how to measure your success and what do the metrics of success look like, right? You have innovative output, you have revenue, but you also have a culture and you have employees that you not only attract, but you want to retain those employees so that they can be part of your extended family at work. And so I think, that's one. I think a lot of venture capitalists that are emerging onto the scene, people like Charles Hudson and the woman from 500 Startups. I can't think of her name off
and
the
also
top
the guys,
of my head.
I know the guys from Connectivity Capital as well.
Yep, from Connectivity Capital. That would be Denmark West. Full disclosure, he's my partner and advisor on Culture Shift Labs and Culture Shifting Weekends. You have Kanye Macabella. You have Richard Kirby. There's a lot of women on the scene like Keisha Cash. To be honest with you, there are more venture capitalists like that and also that care about growth and innovation through inclusion than are being reported in the press. There's a lot of lists out there and things like that. But honestly, Steve, there is a growing body of people, of individuals, of people inside of companies that really care about this. They're very deliberate in both in finding and funding the next generation of entrepreneurs and inventors, women and of color, etc. So there's a lot going on out there. And again, it goes back to what I was saying earlier, is how are you curating your content? What are you reading where you're actually seeing some of these success stories? And a lot of times I talk to venture capitalists who are doing this under the radar, people like August Capital, David Hornick, right, who's very, very involved in GLAD, who is now getting involved in, working with the incarcerated. So you have people that are not going out there publicly beating their chest and saying, hey, write an article about what I'm doing. And what I'm going to encourage you to do is next week and the following week and every week thereafter for the next 50 weeks, interview somebody like me. And I want you to own that space around that kind of positive content. I have to actually encourage them to go out there and tell their story about what they're doing so that other venture capitalists will be inspired by them and say, oh, wow, I didn't realize that we can be doing those things as well. And the truth is that, leaders like to be competitive. I mean, they're very competitive. So if they know that their peers are doing something in this space, they'll want to do it better. And not everybody wants to go out there. They're doing it because they genuinely believe in it and they don't need credit for it. So sometimes my job is out there being the Pied Piper and telling people to be more public about what it is that they're committed to and how it's driven results, diversity and inclusion, outcomes, and success stories. So just so you know, my work is focused on bright spots, positive examples, and success stories. And I try and find that and amplify it as much as possible through my newsletter, through social media, through the events that I do, the way that I curate rooms. But there are a lot of people doing amazing, amazing work. Even Tim Draper is doing some amazing things. And I don't think people are really that vocal about it. There's been a mention or two of it, but it's certainly not been publicized in a very, very large way.
So if I bring this all together, what would you expect to happen in these companies that do embrace diversity and inclusion?
A lot of the experts and a lot of the leaders that really care deeply about this say we hope to get to a point where we're so successful that they don't even need a chief diversity officer. It's just embedded in the culture, right? That's the ultimate goal. But I think realistically, that's like saying, all right, tomorrow we want to figure out if the Earth was created through the Big Bang or for theory of evolution. I mean, we just haven't figured that out yet, right? We haven't mastered that. So I do think that we want to get to a point where the majority of companies are committed to creating business models that get all the facets of diversity and inclusion right. And they're committed to, over time, perfecting each part of it because it's multifaceted. I think that people need to be more realistic and more celebratory of the companies that are owning a piece of it because not every company has the budget that could get it right. A lot of times it does require large budgets to get all of the facets working well together. So I'd like to see more companies commit more resources to figuring it out, getting it right, and evolving it over time.
So I think that's a great outcome. And you mentioned earlier in the answer to the question that your job is to bring out the success stories and let people know to create momentum. And I've noted today that you've talked about SAP, GE, Goldman Sachs, Frito-Lay. Any other success stories that come to mind of companies that have really built diversity, inclusion, and empathy into their DNA?
There are companies that are learning, that are committed to investing the time, money, and resources to evolve over time. And I could talk about some of the work that Visa is doing in their innovation lab and how they're being inclusive. I could talk about the work that Denmark is doing at Connectivity Capital Partners, and educating that organization to work towards getting it right. I could talk about Salesforce and how Salesforce is they started with being committed to and perfecting the LGBT diversity and inclusion internally and externally, and now they're moving on to some other things. I could talk about J.P. Morgan Chase and how Jamie Dimon has committed to Black leadership, right? So there are pieces of it that companies are owning, and they're trying to really get it right.
Last question here, and this is really for my own curiosity. Being that this podcast is called Intangibles, have you noticed any commonalities about the types of leaders that embrace diversity and inclusion? I mean, we talked about curiosity. You talked about openness. Are there any other traits that you've noticed about the people who are willing to embrace these culturally?
Yeah, I think the traits are just humility. These are people that may or may not take themselves very seriously, but they definitely are some of the most open-minded and curious people that I've ever met. And they have a learning mentality. They create a learning culture. I wouldn't say this is a trait as much as, I guess, it's not even a quality. I'm not sure what you'd call it, but a lot of the times, let's say if you have a male leader that is really interested in this and very committed to it, it's because they have daughters, because they had a lot of influence by their mother, their grandmother, their aunts, because they really were reared to respect women, and they have a certain type of relationship with their wife where their wife is saying, hey, I know you're the chairman and CEO of, fill in the blank, but you still put your pants on one leg at a time, and I think you could do a better job at this. And so these are people that are curious, like to learn, and they're just there's just a lot of humility about them.
Perfect. Okay, those are the prepared questions. Before we close, is there anything else that you'd like to discuss that I might have missed? Anything important?
Just want to make sure that people know that I have I am a consultant. And so, just talking a little bit about that, I think people just may know that I'm a founder and they know the name of the company and that I've written books. But the fact that I do have a consultancy that helps, cities, philanthropists, and leaders with growth and innovation through inclusion.
So in that sense, where should people go to find you?
They can go to cultureshiftlabs.com and also read a little bit about cultureshiftingweekends.com.
Great. Andrea, let's end here. Thank you very much for your time and your insight. I really enjoyed this, and I think what you've got to say is really valuable, more valuable these days in a kind of increasingly polarized time in our history. So thank you so much.
No, thank you so much, Steve. And at the end of the day, the thing that I just want to leave you with personally is that we could talk about diversity, empathy, and all the things in between, and inclusion and the connections to each other. But, companies that care about growth and innovation through inclusion are the ones that are going to win at the end of the day. And there's a lot within growth and innovation through inclusion, but I think I'm excited about what's coming down the pike in that way.
Well, that's super optimistic. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you. Take care, Steve.
This has been Intangibles, a podcast created by Antecedent Ventures. Find out more at www.antecedent.vc. I'd like to thank Denton's Venture Technology Group at dentonsventurebeyond.com for being the sponsor this season and a supportive partner. Operating as a boutique within the world's largest law firm, the Venture Technology Group runs with hard-charging tech entrepreneurs to drive growth through strategic business, finance, and legal advice, from Silicon Valley and New York to London, Berlin, Hong Kong, and beyond. Learn more at dentonsventurebeyond.com. I'd also like to thank Ben Glowy, who's been instrumental in helping me record and produce this season. I couldn't have done it without him. Find him on Twitter at visible_sound. And thank you. Keep an eye out for the next episode, and if you like this one, leave us a favorable review. I'm your host, Steve Berg.